President Yoon Suk Yeol addressed the U.S. Congress, becoming the first South Korean leader to do so in nearly a decade. Yoon stressed Seoul and Washington will put their alliance in action as a compass for freedom in the world. The South Korean leader also took the time to attend the Global Video Content Leadership Forum, joined by the country's Culture Minister Park Bo-gyun. There, Yoon vowed his full support, from expanding collaborative production to revitalizing investment, to make the two countries' cultural cooperation as lively as possible. And for the first time as a South Korean leader, President Yoon visited the Pentagon's National Military Command Center, a symbolic move that shows a solid combined defense posture between the two allies. Good morning. Welcome to New Day at Arirang. I'm Kim Da-mi in Seoul. We begin this morning with President Yoon Suk Yeol's address at U.S. Congress. Let's head over to Washington, D.C., where our Yoon Jung-min is standing by. Good evening, Jung-min.
Hi, Dami. It was another day full of diplomacy for South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol, this time with U.S. lawmakers.
Right, a speech full of emphasis on freedom and the Seoul-Washington alliance. He also made some witty comments that stole the scene there, huh?
That is right. I will bring you all the details.
Right, then fill us in there, Jung-min.
Thanks, Tommy. It's a little past 8 in the evening, April 27th. Live from Washington, D.C., I'm Yoon Jung-min. In short, freedom, democracy, and a 70-year-old alliance forged in blood were among the key messages delivered by the South Korean president. For more, let me introduce our expert this evening. I'm joined by Mr. Scott Snyder, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Good evening.
Good evening.
So, Mr. Snyder, what stood out to you during President Yoon's 40-minute speech at Capitol Hill earlier today?
I think the first thing that really stands out is that President Yoon may be even better at American politics than he is at Korean politics. A joint session of Congress is a special event, and we saw the House Speaker and the Vice President next to each other. But I think that the core message was really President Yoon told Korea's development story, but in a way that Americans could also understand it, and it had a heavy dose of American influence on South Korea. I think a second thing that he did was to give a little bit more of a rationale and understanding for why President Yoon talks about freedom and the way that South Korea can play a role in upholding freedom in the world. And of course, he had two main case studies, the Ukraine and North Korean human rights. And he had a very evocative phrase that South Korea could be a compass for freedom.
All right, I will get back to you later for in-depth discussions. But first, here are today's headlines. During his Congress speech, President Yoon Suk Yeol highlighted 70 years of the ROK-U.S. alliance as he set out a blueprint for the next 70 years ahead. Our presidential office correspondent Oh Soo-young files this report.
Inspired by freedom, liberal democracy and human rights, South Korea and the United States will put their alliance in action as a compass for freedom in the world. That was the core of President Yoon Suk Yeol's speech to a joint session of the U.S. Congress on Thursday. Reflecting on the past 70 years of bilateral security ties, Yoon described how South Korea, by joining hands with the U.S., had grown from the ashes of the Korean War to become the world's 10th largest economy, based on liberal democracy and a free market system.
For over 70 years in the history of the alliance, we worked together in military and security sectors. We also expanded our cooperation in the economic field. Our relationship has evolved from one of unilateral assistance to a partnership that is mutually beneficial.
He noted that Korean companies are now contributing to the U.S. economy, producing EV batteries, semiconductors and cars, and creating thousands of well-paid jobs. Going forward, he said the two countries will lead in innovation beyond security and foreign policy to work on cutting-edge technologies, including chips, artificial intelligence, bioscience and quantum technology. But beyond economic relations, Yoon presented how the alliance would jointly tackle challenges to the freedom and rights of citizens around the world. He highlighted human rights abuses in North Korea, describing what he called unspeakable and horrendous incidents where men and women were killed for violating COVID-19 measures, publicly executed for watching South Korean shows, and being shot in public for their religious faith. Yoon also condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
It is an attempt to unilaterally change the status quo with force. Korea strongly condemns the unprovoked armed attack against Ukraine.
Saying freedom and democracy are again under threat, Yoon said South Korea will rise to defend global citizens based on its own history of being invaded by North Korea and living up to its current economic capacity. He also thanked the members of Congress for unanimously adopting a resolution that welcomed his state visit. The document stressed the importance of the bilateral alliance for peace and security on the Korean Peninsula and across the Indo-Pacific region. Receiving 23 standing ovations, President Yoon's speech marks the first time in 10 years that a South Korean leader has addressed the US Congress, the heart and soul of US democracy. Based on their shared universal values, he said the alliance will march towards the future for the freedom of humanity. Oh Soo-young, Arirang News, Washington, D.C.
Freedom was a central theme in President Yoon's speech, as we just heard, while historical figures and the names of Korean companies also grabbed attention. Our Lee Dae-hyun has more.
President Yoon has become the third world leader to address a joint meeting of Congress since President Biden took office. In his nearly 1-hour-long speech delivered in English, Yoon presented a blueprint of the South Korea-US alliance as a global tie to protect liberty and peace. The term freedom appeared 46 times in the speech, more than Yoon has ever previously used the word during his presidency. A number of historical figures were also mentioned, including those who had contributed to the bilateral alliance during the Korean War.
The late John Conyers Jr., Sam Johnson, and Howard Coble were veteran congressmen who promoted freedom and democracy. The former Representative Charles Rangel has been a strong supporter of the alliance. Korea will never forget the great American heroes who fought with us to defend freedom.
Names of Korean businesses and K-pop stars were also brought up. When mentioning Hyundai Motors' plant in the state of Georgia, Yoon smiled and pointed at members from that state as the two elected members from Georgia stood up and applauded. Many world leaders might like to be invited to give a speech in a joint meeting of Congress, but the process can be demanding. A bipartisan group of congressional leaders should agree on the address, while a diplomatic strategy should also be made to persuade Congress. Yoon's speech marks the 7th time a South Korean president has addressed a joint meeting of Congress, and the first time in 10 years since former President Park Geun-hye did so in 2013. Ri Seung-man, the first president of South Korea, also made a speech in a joint meeting of Congress, followed by Roh Tae-woo and Kim Young-sam. With the exception of former presidents Kim Young-sam and Lee Myung-bak, other former South Korean leaders made speeches in English. Yoon, at the end of his speech, mentioned Roh's speech from 34 years ago, saying that Roh's dream to make the Indo-Pacific more important to Washington, with Korea contributing to the prosperity of the region, has now become a reality. He added Seoul will strengthen the rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific while taking a comprehensive approach to expanding cooperation with key partners. Lee Dae-hyun, Arirang News.
President Yoon's stay in Washington, D.C. has wrapped up, and just before he left for Boston, he had the chance to meet with some big names in the movie industry here in the U.S. So let's connect with our top office correspondent, Kim Do-yeon, to get the latest. Do-yeon, we know culture exchanges has been a big part of the state visit to the U.S., so this is an example, isn't it?
Jongmin, you are absolutely right. With the power that South Korean content has, President Yoon really wanted to take full advantage of that for his trip this time around to Washington, D.C. Now, I do have to note and emphasize, though, that this particular event, called the Global Video Content Leadership Forum, was actually organized by the American Motion Picture Association, and I'm standing right in front of their headquarters where the forum actually took place. American media companies like Paramount, Warner Brothers, Discovery, NBC Universal, Sony Pictures, the Walt Disney, and the Netflix all attended the event. Now, from South Korean side, entertainment companies like CJ, SLL, and Watcha were here. According to the spokesperson for the presidential office, having such big names all in one place shows how much the U.S. market is interested in collaborating with the Korean content industry. President Yoon, addressing the CEOs and other major players in the industry, promised his full support, saying that both South Korean and U.S. content is deeply rooted in freedom, something that is relatable to fans across the world. Now, he added that he expects culture exchanges to expand as a result of this important event. It's also worth noting that the Minister of Culture was part of the delegation on this trip, and he was here at the forum. It was the first time that a culture minister has joined a South Korean president on a trip to the U.S. He also had the chance to appeal to U.S. companies for further investment in South Korea. Following the event, actually, the Korea Creative Content Agency and the Korea Film Council together signed an MOU with Netflix to foster more talent in the production industry among young Koreans while expanding Korean content globally. Now, that's all I got for you now. Back to you, Jungmin.
Thank you, Doyan. Following the Washington Declaration, the South Korean president today paid a visit to the Pentagon, where he received a briefing on U.S. surveillance and crisis response system, becoming the first South Korean president to visit the Pentagon's National Military Command Center. Shin Ha-young has more.
During his trip to Washington, South Korean President Yoon Suk Yeol also paid a visit to the Pentagon, where he received a briefing. The visit to the headquarters of national security and the U.S. Armed Forces is being viewed as a move to underscore South Korea-U.S. combined defense readiness, coming a day after Yoon and Biden announced the Washington Declaration aimed at bolstering extended deterrence against North Korea's evolving threats. Yoon met with U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and was given a briefing on the U.S. surveillance and crisis response system at the Pentagon's National Military Command Center, marking the first time that a South Korean president has visited the center. South Korea's first deputy director of the National Security Office, who is traveling with the president, described it as a key command and control center that directly assists the U.S. president and military commanders in times of emergency. During the talks, President Yoon also reiterated the importance of the Washington Declaration, saying that he completely trusts U.S. pledges on extended deterrence, while Austin said the determination of the U.S. to defend South Korea is strong. Meanwhile, Yoon also became the first foreign president to visit the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, which develops innovative technologies for combat and national security. There, he discussed how such a research environment can lead to technological innovations and measures to bolster bilateral cooperation on defense science and technology. Shin Ha-young, Arirang News.
After addressing Congress, President Yoon was hosted by the U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris and State Secretary Tony Blinken for lunch, where he vowed to further brighten the Seoul-Washington alliance in the future. Choi Min-jung reports.
Shortly after making an address to a joint session of Congress on Thursday, President Yoon was joined by U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris and Secretary of State Antony Blinken for lunch at the State Department. There, President Yoon vowed to develop the Seoul-Washington alliance in a way that expands practical benefits for the people of both countries.
우리의 미래는 과거보다 더 찬란할 것입니다. 우리 양국은 강력한 힘에 의한 평화를 구축하고 동아시아와 세계의 평화를 촉진하는 자유의 연대를 이끌어갈 것입니다.
Yoon said this would be done by further strengthening solidarity and cooperation in cutting-edge technologies, including semiconductors, quantum artificial intelligence, space, and cyber technology. He added that young talents of the two nations will learn from one another and build a free, peaceful, and prosperous Indo-Pacific region. U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris touted South Korea-U.S. relations as she thanked Yoon's leadership for enabling further progress for the two nations in areas across security, economy, and culture.
I believe our nations and our people are increasingly bound together in a shared future and a common destiny. We are more interconnected and interdependent than we have ever been. And that, I believe, is to the benefit of all of humanity.
And State Secretary Antony Blinken made a remark in Korean, saying the two countries go together.
It has been 70 years since the United States and the Republic of Korea formed our alliance, making official a bond that was forged by Korean and American soldiers in the crucible of war. Kachi Kapshida, we go together.
President Yoon said South Korea was able to rise from the ashes of war to become a country with global stature thanks to the U.S., and stated that the U.S. alliance has developed into the most successful alliance in history over the past 70 years. Choi Min-jung, Arirang News.
Wrapping up his itinerary in Washington, D.C., President Yoon is now on his way to Boston. The president will visit the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, home to a world-class bio cluster. There, he will hold talks with leading scholars in the digital and bio sectors. Also, President Yoon will hold a roundtable with experts and business people working in innovation clusters and host a panel session at Harvard University's Kennedy School on economic freedom and liberal democracy. Let's delve deeper into President Yoon's Congress speech and other diplomatic engagements. Mr. Snyder, so freedom was the centerpiece of the South Korean president's Congress speech, with Yoon mentioning it that 46 times in his speech. And he also was vocal about propaganda and fake news that undermine democracy. What do you read into that?
Well, I think that he was trying to speak to a theme that he has been emphasizing since his inauguration, and also one that he thought would be resonant with the U.S. Congress. It is very interesting to hear him talking about disinformation, because that actually is, I think, has emerged as a shared problem that exists in modern democracies, including the United States. And so, in that sense, it's kind of ironic to think about him talking about disinformation in front of a very divided U.S. Congress.
That's some point there. You have some point there. So, and President Yoon condemned the attack on Ukraine, calling it an attempt to unilaterally change the status quo with force. This as South Korea tries to raise its voice on the global stage.
Well, it was a pretty full-throated pledge of support for the Ukraine and against the unlawful violation of Ukraine's borders. And it raises some questions. I think it raises expectations about whether or not South Korea might become more involved in the cause of supporting Ukraine militarily going forward.
Right. And the president noted the mutually beneficial nature of the allies' economic cooperation, adding that Korean investments into the U.S. are creating tens of thousands of jobs. Perhaps this as Korean businesses are concerned about the U.S. CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act.
Well, that, I think, is an ongoing issue. But as far as it relates to his address to Congress, South Korean investment, I think, is the secret sauce that makes President Yoon very popular on Capitol Hill. because the fact of the matter is that more congressmen are interested in seeing and meeting with President Yoon in the context of South Korean investment flows into the United States. And I saw that directly. It was very interesting at the launch hosted by the Vice President that the representatives from Congress came to participate in that meeting as well, because President Yoon has and South Korea has been investing in those districts where the representatives were coming from.
And Mr. Snyder, there was also a mention of violations of human rights in North Korea. And while the president urges the regimes to stop provocations and return to diplomacy. So in what way can U.S. lawmakers help address this particular issue?
Well, I don't necessarily think that President Yoon was making an ask to the U.S. Congress. In fact, the U.S. Congress has already built out a platform on North Korean human rights that the Biden administration is trying to follow through in terms of implementing. And so I think this was really more about shining the spotlight on North Korean human rights violations, while at the same time re-emphasizing some of his core North Korea policy focuses, including the possibility of dialogue as a way of achieving denuclearization.
All right. And following the announcement of the Washington Declaration, yesterday that was, the South Korean commander-in-chief was briefed by high-ranking U.S. officials at the Pentagon earlier today. What message are the allies trying to send here?
Well, I think that visit to the Pentagon was very interesting in the context of the Washington Declaration, because it provided a visual image of what it looks like for the U.S. and South Korea to consult with each other at high levels. And of course, not everything can be done in a short briefing meeting, but I think that it signals the direction that both leaderships are trying to go in as related to the Washington Declaration.
All right. Scott Snyder from the Council on Foreign Relations, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Now the president wraps up a series of diplomatic events here in D.C. as he heads to Boston to meet scholars and the young generation. And for more of the day's other headlines, back to the Arirang News studio in Seoul with our Kim Dami. Tami.
Thanks, Jungmin. We are staying in the U.S. though. The country's GDP growth was sluggish last year, rising at a pace of 1.1%. A sign that shows the U.S. is being held back. But President Joe Biden insists the American economy remains strong. Lee Seung-jae with more.
According to preliminary data released by the U.S. Commerce Department on Thursday, U.S. GDP grew at a 1.1% annualized pace in the first quarter of this year. The latest figure is well below the 2% estimate, showing a clear sign that the U.S. economy is slowing. The slowdown is all the more noticeable as GDP in the U.S. grew 2.6% in the first quarter of last year. The report cited a decline in private inventory investment and a slowdown in non-residential fixed investment. Experts, however, believe the U.S. Fed's aggressive rate hikes to battle inflation are beginning to take effect, adding that such figures could lead to the U.S. Central Bank to halt its rate hikes for the time being. Despite Thursday's grim data, U.S. President Joe Biden touted the latest GDP report, stating that the figures prove that the American economy remains strong as it transitions to steady and stable growth. Biden said that in the first quarter of this year, real personal disposable income increased and American consumers continued to spend, even as the overall pace of growth moderated. He added that the U.S. added more than 300,000 jobs per month during the quarter, while the unemployment rate remained near a 50-year low. As Biden announced his re-election bid earlier this week, the economy and inflation remain his biggest domestic vulnerability. American voters have pointed to inflation as their top domestic issue, while economists have predicted that the economy will shrink further throughout the remainder of 2023. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
The system used to classify important items of cultural significance in South Korea is set for an overhaul. The changes come as the Cultural Heritage Administration announced on Thursday that the National Heritage Framework Act passed the plenary session of the National Assembly. Cultural heritage will now be called national heritage and will be divided into 3 subcategories: cultural heritage, natural heritage, and intangible heritage. The changes will come into effect by May 2024. Meanwhile, the act also includes the designation of December 9th as National Heritage Day. BTS member Suga is on the road to perform for his fans all over the world. His first solo world tour, titled Suga August D-Day Tour, began on Wednesday local time at the UBS Arena in New York City. There, he performed his recent single release, D-Day, as well as songs from his various mixtapes, including August D and D2. The tour will reach 9 countries over the next 2 months, including Indonesia, Thailand, Singapore, and South Korea. Suga said he's been training relentlessly for this solo tour and that he hopes fans will enjoy the concerts. Now, this is his first world tour as a solo artist and also the first BTS member to go on the tour by themselves.
Good morning, I'm Matthew Ashley, and we now turn over to stories from around the world. We begin with the world's oceans, where temperatures over the past few weeks have reached record highs. According to climate scientists, preliminary data from the National Oceanic and Atmosphere Administration shows that the ocean's average surface temperature reached 21.1 degrees Celsius at the start of April, rising a relatively large 0.36 degrees from March. Now, the new figure beats its previous high of 21 degrees set in April 2016. The changes have been linked to warm weather on the back of the El Nino, combined with global warming. The increased temperatures come after a 3-year cooling period from the La Nina. Now, scientists are still determining what the warmer oceans could mean for atmospheric temperatures, but they predict an increase in extreme weather conditions. Moving on to the Gulf of Oman, where the United States Navy says that on Thursday, Iran seized a U.S.-bound oil tanker. Now, the Suez tanker, a Marshall Islands-flagged vessel, was contracted by Chevron to deliver oil to Texas from Kuwait, where it was last docked. The ship has a crew of 24 members, all of whom are Indian. Iranian state media, meanwhile, has reported that the ship was seized after it collided with an Iranian vessel on Wednesday evening. It did not identify the seized ship. The U.S. Navy says that this is at least the 5th vessel taken by Iran in just 2 years. And finally, legendary talk show host Jerry Springer has died, aged 79. According to his family, he passed away on Thursday after a brief illness. Springer was most famous for headlining the Jerry Springer Show. It was a provocative American talk show that often saw invited guests argue and fight over domestic disputes. The show ran 27 years and broadcast nearly 5,000 episodes. Before his broadcasting career, Springer was the mayor of Cincinnati and also a political reporter. He was born during World War II in 1944 in a London underground station that was being used as a bomb shelter.
Good morning. The last workday of April looks to be a fine one with a few things to be mindful of. Morning temperatures are kicking off about 1 to 5 degrees higher than yesterday with a thick fog covering southern provinces. Then highs will rise fast, leading to big gaps in ratings in between lows and highs in most parts of the country. Daily highs will go up even a couple of degrees higher than norms with good air quality nationwide. Sunny skies to start out the day, then turning cloudy with rain in the forecast from Jeju tonight. That rain will spread nationwide overnight before letting up from tomorrow afternoon. Jeju and Gyeongsang-Namdo province could see up to 40 millimeters of rainfall. Now, it could be a 3-day weekend for some, with Monday marking Labor Day in Korea. Other than on Saturday, the weather will be calm and promising through Monday. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
That wraps up today's New Day at Arirang. We'll be back next week for Monday's edition at the same time. Please stay with us for more updates throughout the day. Thanks for watching.
choices we make today, I believe, are going to determine the direction of our world and the future of our kids for decades to come. That's why this partnership is so important, Mr. President, because we share the same values, the same vision.
한미동맹은 세계 평화와 번영에 기여하는 정의로운 동맹으로서 이러한 위기를 함께 극복해 나가고 있습니다. 우리는 한미 글로벌 포괄적 전략 동맹의 깊이와 외연을 더욱 확장하고 미래로 전진해 나갈 것입니다.
어색한 공개와 멈출 만큼 빛나는 걸까. You're my kid, today my birthday. Your love, Miss Creeping candy special for you.
What matters?
솔직한 사랑 표현법을 담은 곡입니다.
동시에 느낄 수 있는 곡인데요.
내 목소린 널 입술.
뮤직.
이분.
We're here to make a new type of news.
New insights, new styles, and new topics every day.
We are News Generation. Making news just for you. It's April 28th here in Seoul. I'm Shin Yeun, and this is News Generation, where we make the news at Arirang's very own open studio. Every morning, we'll discuss the top issues and latest current affairs affecting people in their 20s and 30s. Joining me in the studio is Cheska Dainhong.
Happy Friday, everyone!
Happy Friday!
And Nelsong.
Happy Friday! Happy Friday! It's the last time we'll see each other in April. Oh yeah, last day in April.
Yes.
But anywho, both are here to speak on behalf of people in their 20s and 30s. Starting with our news feed, which covers different hashtags and news items that have been trending on social media over the past 24 hours. Now, 21 universities in South Korea, including the country's top-ranked ones like Seoul National University, will start considering school violence records in their regular admissions processes for the 2025 school year. Now, this measure follows more voices arguing that bullying should have heavier consequences. Moving on to the second story, Kazakhstan has amended its labor law so that most people will only have to work 4 days per week from July. Now, the new labor code requires every employee to rest on Sunday. The second and third days off can be determined by each company's labor regulations. Moving on to the last item, recently a video showing a 14-year-old detained at a police station in Korea went viral. It shows a boy in handcuffs kicking police officers, swearing, and trying to pick a fight. Now, this enraged many. For a long time now, the public have demanded that the age of criminal responsibility be lowered by 1 year from the current 14, considering the gravity of crimes committed by juveniles. Currently, minors under the age of 14 cannot be convicted of a crime here in Korea. Now, I saw this video too. I was very enraged. And are you guys for or against lowering the minimum age to be convicted of a crime here in Korea?
Absolutely for. And I mean, I think the issue is that they understand what they're doing. They understand, they have the knowledge of what they're doing, and they're completely unapologetic for it. And perhaps if the parents educated them at home and disciplined them saying you should not be doing this, I think, you know, it would be a little better, but it's not happening. And if this did already happen, we wouldn't be here in the first place. So yes, I'm definitely for, and it's very tragic.
Yeah, and they not only understand that they're doing it, they understand that they could get away with it.
Yep.
I think that's the critical point there. But what are your thoughts on this, Cheska?
I say this with great emphasis, but the conviction age must be lowered. But that is not just the solution, and it must be accompanied by a constructive and proactive solution for these first-time, very young offenders. And Yeon, we actually discussed in the episode of The Glory and high school violence about the importance of government and specialist intervention, because a lot of these offenders need to be educated and rehabilitated. Because a lot of the times it's about, as you said, Niall, it's about the parenting or sometimes, you know, very destructive household that causes these people to fall into the wrong route. So I think, again, I say this with great emphasis, the solution is not just lowering the age, but building a society where they can actually add value to the society.
Better infrastructure, better counseling programs, better education, not only for the children, but also for the parents as well. And that was our news feed for this Friday. Moving on, we're soon going to see President Yoon's state visit to Washington wrap up. Before returning to Korea, though, he will be visiting Boston to make a speech to students at Harvard. And this prestigious U.S. school has a lot of Korean Americans. And speaking of them, we're going to be talking about how much this community has expanded since the first Korean immigrants stepped foot in the States. For more on today's discussion topic, take a look at the screen. Anything Korean may seem to be booming now, but it wasn't like that when some 7,000 Koreans were recruited and brought to Hawaii as plantation laborers in 1903 to 1905. The first generation of Koreans who stepped foot in the States had it tough. Not being able to speak English and tied down to strenuous jobs requiring a lot of labor, it was hard for many to make a living and adjust, not to mention racism. You may have seen glimpses of how it was like for previous generations of Korean immigrants through movies like the 2020 film Minari or recently released Canadian film Rice Boy Sleeps, which were set in the 80s and 90s. Years have passed, and we're seeing the third generation of Korean Americans. NewsGen aims to answer 3 questions in regards to this growing population. 1, how many Korean Americans are there in the States at the moment, and how's the community like there? 2, how has the Korean American community evolved generation after generation? Do the latest gen think they're more Korean than American, or vice versa? 3, has the K-boom helped Korean Americans better tackle racism or identify crises? Today, we're going to be talking about how our fellow Koreans who've settled in the United States are doing right now. And before we go deeper, Cheska, why don't you tell us just how many Korean Americans live in the States at the moment?
Yes, so as of last year, the estimate was about 1.92 million Korean Americans that are living in the States. I know. And that makes us the 5th largest Asian population.
No way.
Right after like countries like China, Vietnam, and the Philippines. And of course, the largest state is California, with about more than 500,000. But here's what's interesting. More than half of Korean Americans were actually not born in the States, but born in South Korea.
I see.
So I think this adds, as we will delve a little bit deeper in our talk today, adds to the experience and influence of how we identify ourselves.
Definitely. And as you've mentioned, America was long known as the land of opportunity. That's why we've seen so many immigrants go there. And Korean immigration to the States can be largely divided into 3 periods. The first wave from 1903 to 49, when thousands of Koreans headed to Hawaii to work on pineapple and sugar plantations. The second wave was from the 50s to 60s, when a flux of Koreans sought refuge amid the Korean War. From then onwards, the U.S. recruited experts and professionals from Asia, and it's from this period that the Korean immigrant community started including white-collar workers. And from here, we've seen generations of Korean Americans live in the States. So now, why don't you tell us about all these? We're now seeing up to 3 generations of Korean Americans, right?
Yeah.
And I'm betting that they have different distinctive traits. So why don't you walk us through them?
You know, I think like Cheska just mentioned, more than half of the population in the States, they are not born there. So that would be the first generation and the 1.5s, as they call it. And this is not like an exact science, but this is from my observation in the past 20 years. But the first generation of Korean Americans, you know, they're obviously culturally more Korean. They struggled to settle in. English was not their first language, and they often feel strongly connected to Korea, keep up with the Korean news and things like that. But 1.5, as we call them, 1.5 gen, are the people who moved with their parents at a fairly young age, so they had the time to kind of grow into the culture, become fluent in English. And they may have struggled to, adjust to the culture a little bit, but they have become more American than their parents.
Right.
And then there's the second generation, whole different breed.
We're moving up the ladder.
Yes, moving up. And these are people born in the States, born in the United States by definition, and they've become more American than their parents. And 1.5, they grew up speaking English, starting with kindergarten, daycare, elementary school. They, learned English in school. So that's that. But they feel a little less Korean, perhaps, than their parents.
I'm sure.
And it's not. And if they've been discriminated against in school, unfortunately, whether it be because of how they look or the types of lunch boxes they brought to school, I think they have this big identity crisis of, am I American or am I Korean?
Right.
Yeah.
And Naya, you made such a great comment, because some of the things you mentioned, I'm sure all of us do have a similar experience. But I think that's why, as of now, there are some movies like Minari and Rice Boy Sleeps, which is becoming a sensational in the movie scene, that actually talks about these Korean immigrants.
The struggles they go through.
And the real struggles. I mean, what the parents go through, trying to connect with their kids who are distanced because they want to fit into a more, American or foreign community.
Yeah, it's the generational gap and the cultural gap that they're trying to fill, and it's so difficult. And then there's the third generation of Korean Americans who are raised by second generation Korean Americans who had this identity crisis and maybe feel a little more comfortable speaking English at home. And so usually they feel more comfortable speaking English with their children, and now these guys are growing up and fourth generation is a-coming.
Oh my God.
We're expecting them very soon.
Yeah, but unless they make an active effort to connect with their roots and maybe come back to Korea or, stay with their relatives who are more Korean in that way, it's difficult for them to really feel fully Korean.
Right, and we're already seeing second and third generation Korean Americans take up bigger portions of the workforce in the States compared to the first gen. As Nell mentioned, they're not as familiar with Korea or seemingly connected with their traditional roots. But to find out whether this is exactly the case, we have an interview prepared with a second gen Korean American. So we're now going to be hearing from a second-gen Korean American. It's Jaden Song from Oklahoma. Great to have you here, Jaden.
Hi.
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 All right, Jaden, as I said, you're a second-gen Korean American. So why don't you first start us off by telling us when your family first immigrated to the States?
So they came to the States around the mid-90s, and they both arrived here for college. They went to ORU. My mom has a more interesting story. She had jumped from Korea, then went to Spain, then came to Korea. Then came to America right after. And yeah, that's how they met, because they met in that college. And then they've been here since then. So.
All right.
That's very interesting. Jaden, I'm sure you know, but there's a growing influence of Korean culture around the world. And now foreigners are actively choosing South Korea as their travel destination. Now, have you been back to Korea since you left? And if so, when you came back, did you still feel the connection of it being so-called your home country?
Yeah, I have visited Korea a couple of times. The last time I went was in 2014. And it was really interesting because going over there, I did actually feel a sort of connection while I was in there. It wasn't something I could necessarily verbalize as well, but when I went over there, there was a certain sense of belonging, as if it satiated this other part of my identity that I was like, there's something that wasn't quite there that I didn't know what that was until I had that put into context going to Korea.
Yeah, and I also have a question. As a second generation Korean American, I feel like you had your specific set of hardships and struggles. Can you share that a little bit?
I would say those are more in the micro sense as far as the hardships. More so in terms of, I think, as you mentioned before, in terms of coming to terms with identity, because there is that divide between, like, am I American, am I Korean, and I think that it is maintained in halves makes that a little difficult to decipher sometimes. But I think I've learned to become more comfortable as I try and, like, educate myself about it, and also and I still live family who are first-generation Koreans, so it's just good to have that culture there. So it almost feels like I work as a sort of transition gap there, really.
Yeah, I understand that.
For sure, I can relate to that as well. Apart from identity crises, though, there's also the problem of racism. You know, a lot of Asian Americans or the AAPI communities going through that, especially with the advent of COVID-19. But do you think K-pop and Korean culture's boom sort of helped many Korean Americans, go around in the States or anywhere abroad? What are your thoughts on this?
I think to a certain extent it does, especially considering the vast influence media has most of the time. I think getting Americans more exposed to Korean culture and its growing popularity. A lot of people are really invested in K-pop and K-drama and all of that. So I think that is really helpful in terms of kind of forming their perception and, maybe perhaps turning around some things that have been negatively affecting those who have been living in America.
For sure. And lastly, I'd like to ask you, how tight is the Korean American community like there? Are there any activities you've tried to help you stay connected to your Korean roots? And as Nell mentioned here in the studio, each generation seems to have distinctive traits. So are there any episodes you had at these Korean communities where you talked to 1.5 generation or the first generation of Korean Americans and found any similarities and differences?
My main experience has to do with close family or church communities in Korea. I would say those are where they are most tightly knit. And having gone there, to me, what it seems like is there's a lot of first generation Koreans in these groups. So there's a lot more of a traditional sense of traditionalism over there. And that's really interesting for me, since I'm in that middle area. But I don't necessarily find that disparity intimidating, though. If anything, I find it more educational and maybe incentivizes me to learn more and maybe be more involved where I can, because in Oklahoma there aren't that many Koreans.
Yeah, so, right, for sure.
So
really?
you find them where you can.
Oklahoma. All right. Thank you so much, Shaden. It was a pleasure to hear from you today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thank you.
All right, and Jaden provided us a glimpse into what the second-generation Korean Americans are going through, and he mentioned a great point there. Though there is differences in the traits that each generation has to offer, that disparity doesn't break up any Korean ties that he has or bring about miscommunication. And I was very happy to hear that.
And he even said it doesn't intimidate him, but he actually feels educated, which is a great attitude.
Great. It's such a great attitude.
I heard it and I said, I wish I felt that way when I was learning.
It's a very humble learning attitude to have.
Yes. So accepting.
Exactly. Now, before we continue our talks, we are going to hear from our global viewers, and we asked them if they know any Korean Americans and whether they think they're more Korean or American. So take a look at the screen to find out what they had to say. Onju said, I'm Korean American. I was very blessed to be raised by very old school Koreans. So I'm very Korean at home and both went out. Now, Tira's Bell says, one of my friends is Korean American. She was born in Georgia. However, she grew up mostly in Gyeonggi-do in Korea. So I definitely say that she's more Korean than American. And Channy D said, I'm a second-gen Korean American. My dad is a 1.5 gen. Mom is first gen. Best part is I can interact and understand both American culture and Korean culture together. Worst thing is, Koreans will never accept me as a true Korean, and Americans will never see me as a true American. You know what? I think Channy D's comment really got to me because I could relate to this a lot. I mean, everyone here in the studio has lived abroad for a few years. For me too, I lived abroad in the States. When I came back to Korea, I was 12 years old, and I really struggled with finding my roots to Korean culture. I would speak Korean at home. I would eat Korean food because my Korean parents, of course. But when I first came here, I didn't know any Korean.
Oh,
so I couldn't really fit in, and everyone would call me like that girl from America
who doesn't speak Korean.
Who doesn't speak Korean.
Who's bad at Korean. Yes, I've had that label too.
Exactly, and that sort of caused a little bit of an identity crisis for me as well. But what about you guys? Can you relate the problems or difficulties Korean Americans or ethnic Koreans who grew up mostly abroad go through?
With my entire being, yes and yes. I can absolutely relate to everything that we mentioned today. And I think, living in 3 different countries, I really felt like a circle trying to fit into everything but circle.
That's a really good expression.
Right? It's like everywhere you go, you are not quite fitting in. And as you can see from the photos, I mean, this is Central Park. I lived in New York. I traveled in LA. That's Times Square.
Wow.
But everywhere I was, I think I was having this identity crisis. And I think this is very common for people who don't grow up in the country that they are actually born from. And I also felt like that when I first came to Korea, I even had a mild panic attack because I was trying to run in Han River thinking it would be like Central Park. And everyone was looking at me like, what is she doing?
Yeah,
what is she wearing?
What
is she wearing? Why is she, why is she running the way she does? And I think this struggle is very real for all of us. And I'm still trying to adjust. But the solution that I came up with, and I hope this helps some of our viewers, is that, you know what? If I can't be identified and if I'm indefinable, heck, I might as well just be my own category.
Right. What category is that?
Yeah.
A one-of-a-kind category.
Yeah.
Let's all be one of a kind.
Yeah.
What about you now?
definitely fully agree with the whole identity crisis thing growing up abroad. I am ethnically Korean. My parents are Korean. We speak Korean at home, and I have a Korean citizenship, so I can't even call myself American despite the accent. But, you know, I think it's the percentage of Koreanness in me that I'm not really sure is, you know, fully Korean enough for people to identify me as Korean. And I think, you know, it takes a while for you to really stay here and understand which part of you is actually Korean and which part of you is not. But, you know, eventually, like Cheska said, you come to kind of accept you and yourself for who you are. And it's a unique combination, and I love myself for it. And I feel privileged that I get to, like Channy D mentioned, both I can understand both cultures.
For sure. And you know, the funny thing about identity is that you should be the own judge of who you are. Yes. The people around you seem to evaluate for who you to be. For instance, if you're Korean American, they'd be like, you're more American than Korean. It's not up to them to decide, though. It's up to the individual. Now, the next question I have, though, is what are your thoughts on K-culture's growing popularity? And we asked this to Jaden as well. Do you think K-pop and K-culture is making the lives of Korean Americans easier in the States?
I think that's a great question, and I may be a bit biased because I actually lived in the States before this monumental wave of K-culture. So I'm seeing the before and after pretty distinctively, and I'm not sure of the exact magnitude, but I truly believe that this has actually put South Korea on the map. But not just that, but also actually making people want to be, quote, Korea. And I use that in a very general sense. Now, even in the most amazing thing about culture is, in political science, what they call as a soft power, attracting people to want to be more like the country. And even in the article in The Diplomat, it said, quote, a force to be reckoned with. So influential that even read, quote, K-culture can form an approximation of hard power through music and activism that is more powerful than any missile system South Korea has ever deployed.
Wow, that's powerful.
Isn't that a strong statement?
It is a strong statement, and Korea is becoming like a premium brand.
It is. That's exactly. We are branded as a country that everybody, quote, wants to be.
I love it. But there are still efforts that need to be made, right?
Like, and I mean, while I do agree with the idea that it's soft power and it's actually really powerful soft power, it's the first step. It's a great first step, and eventually people need to get deeper than just the entertainment and the media to get to know the country, get to know the culture, for, you know, for people to really say, oh, my struggles have been lifted a little more. Just identifying people as the type of, you know, K-pop song isn't going to resolve their identity crisis because they don't fully understand the culture.
All right, and there still needs to be efforts to tackle many unsettled issues, for instance, racism. Helping people out with their identity crisis, but we'll have to see hate crimes, and we'll have to see more efforts being held on this field. But due to time, we have to end up here now. And we'll be here every day from 9:30 a.m. to 10 a.m. Korea time, bringing you more topics that young people are talking about. Special thanks to Cheska Deinhoff.
Thank you so much. This was a fun discussion.
It was. And Nelsong, thank you for having me. And thank you, everyone, for watching. We'll see you next week. We are News Generation.
I'm live.
저를 도와주시는 분들이
저희와 함께 해주시는 세션분들
아무리 봐도 이거 먹지 펜션 같은데 아니라고 아무도 안 하는 거고.
좋아요.
한번 이후엔
춥지 않은가요?